Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining the Working Group 3 meeting for the Extended Day Ahead Market Initiative, which focuses on the greenhouse gas accounting and costs. I'm Brenda Corona, representing the ISO Stakeholder Affairs Group, and I will be providing support for this meeting. For today's agenda, we will have Kevin Head go over the goals for this meeting, and then we will hopefully see Mark Rossleader join us at the meeting to give a few introductory remarks. And then the bulk of this meeting will be review on the workshop and open questions in the unspecified zonal approach. And then we will have Brian Jacobson go through a recap of the discussion, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up this group with Kevin, and we will make sure we answer any questions. And then also we have Phil Pentingale, who is our coordinator for the EDAM working group, available to respond to any questions. Few meeting reminders is that this is intended to be collaborative, and we encourage you to ask questions and share your perspectives on the topics. Please feel free to raise your hand at any time, and Kevin will call on you. Once your line is unmuted, please start by stating your name and affiliation before you speak, and then after your question is addressed, please feel free to put your hand down. That way we could go ahead and respond to other attendees. And then this meeting is recorded and will be post video files to the corresponding working group page. And these materials are related. Materials will not be allowed to be reprinted without the ISO's permission. I'll go ahead and turn it to Kevin Head. He'll go over the meeting agenda and objectives.
Hey everyone, welcome to Working Group 3, our final working group. Just a quick revision to that agenda. We thought Mark was going to be able to join us at the beginning, but it's looking like he will instead join us towards the end. So instead of introductory remarks, he'll be giving maybe some conclusory remarks, if that's a word. Anyway, sorry, let me just pull my notes. So thanks again for the presentation last week, or on Tuesday. Callie and WPTF did a great presentation about a potential new baseline methodology in the resource-specific approach. This would be a variation on that resource-specific approach, which introduces a new constraint to the greenhouse gas attribution. In particular, it would limit the attributable megawatts to just the incremental dispatch above an optimized baseline level. So if you haven't taken a look at the materials or had a chance to review the recording, which hopefully is either up or will be up shortly, I'd encourage you to do that. So thanks again, Callie and WPTF. Turning towards today, well, a little bit more retrospective review. So I did the math on this and a little bit of research. So a typical university course that qualifies for 3 credit hours is usually like 12 to 15 weeks, so 36 to 45 contact hours. Well, we've had 20 working groups, approximately 2 hours each, so that'd be roughly 40 hours. So in addition to all the progress we've made on this EDAM working group designed for greenhouse gas costs, we've effectively all taken a college course in carbon pricing policies at the subnational level and their intersection with electricity markets, which is exciting. But all joking aside, I just want to say thank you to everyone who participated in the calls. It's really been an honor and a pleasure working with you guys, learning everything in this area together, and I hope that you think we've made some good progress as well. So let's have one more great meeting to wrap this up. I'd like to spend most of today's call on workshopping 2 issues in the unspecified or zonal approach. Those 2 areas are sort of broadly compliance reporting and settlements, and the definition and calculation of the hurdle rate. So without further ado, I will switch over to a document that I had prepared. All right, so you guys should see my screen. Yep, cool, it's up on the screen. So what I'd like to do is pick up sort of where we left off in last week's meeting, where we were talking about compliance reporting and settlements in the unspecified approach. And just to tee up the conversation, so where we had left off was we were discussing the case where the non-greenhouse gas zone had overcome the hurdle rate and served the greenhouse gas zone in a particular time interval. That creates revenue that the ISO would collect. Let's call it hurdle rate revenue for the time being. And that revenue is based on the hurdle rate multiplied by basically the megawatts that were transferred. So now we have a big pot of money and we have to figure out what do we do with this. And so the intervening step there is thinking about where the compliance obligation would sit. And I'd like to express that we're exploring hypotheticals here, right? Ultimately, any compliance obligation and the assignment of those will be subject to California Air Resources Board, Washington Department of Ecology, or some other entity's jurisdictional authority. And we can't presume anything that we're doing in this working group would be approved by those agencies, right? So we have to think through the potential scenarios that might arise. And this also applies to the discussion that we held last week. I hope that participants didn't think that the ISO was presuming to dictate the approach that the various states should take in their policy and regulatory processes, but rather what we're trying to do is attempting to engage in an exercise to understand how this approach might work. So, you know, we've gathered this pot of money. We have to figure out what to do with it, and I think we would want that to align with how the compliance obligations would be allocated. And so the purpose of this effort is really to play out the different types of scenarios the way that compliance obligation could be theoretically, and then understanding how they might be allocated would possibly drive how the financial transactions are settled through the EDAM market. So what I'd like to do is talk through a few of those hypotheticals and think through, okay, you know, if we take that pot of money and, if the compliance obligation were to be assigned to load, how would we allocate the hurdle rate revenue? And alternatively, if it were assigned to supply, how would we allocate the hurdle rate revenue in that case? So really, we're just to summarize, we're thinking about, okay, how do we settle this hurdle rate revenue, depending on two scenarios, which would be ultimately determined by the state regulators, but in order to have a sufficiently detailed proposal, we need to think through all the way to the settlements process. So we're trying to understand, based on these two hypothetical scenarios, how we might allocate the funds. So I wanted to start with the potential of assigning to load. I think this is what the unspecified or zonal approach had originally considered might be the most likely alternative, or this was sort of the intent behind it. So I wanted to raise the question to the working group. So if the compliance obligation is allocated to load, and that could be either to load serving entities within the greenhouse gas zone or to electric distribution utilities within the greenhouse gas zone, there's maybe a finer distinction between these two. So if we were to allocate to those parties, how would we allocate it to them? I should say, how should the financial transactions be settled? So I would generally assume that we would do it based on the pro rata megawatts of load being served. But I just wanted to make sure that we raised this topic in the working group. So the first hand that I saw go up was Kathleen Colbert. Kathleen, do you have any thoughts on this? Kathleen
Okay,
Colbert.
I'm unmuted now. Thanks.
Oh.
You should hear me. Can you hear me? Okay, great. It's Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Can you hear me now, Kevin?
Yes.
So I had looked at one of the older versions. So I also have a question. I have a bit of a response for what I thought of through so far, and then a question for you of where it fits kind of in these options, or if it's a new one. is when I took a step back when you first sent around the open questions sheet, my reaction was that the hurdle revenue should be allocated to the load serving entities within the greenhouse gas area, compliance area, on a load ratio share basis. And the concept there being that our expectation would be that the load serving entity under this approach would be responsible for retiring allowances associated with these hurdle rate transfers on a load ratio share basis. Hence, that's why I was thinking it would be allocated like that. I think it's an alternative because I see pro rata, not load ratio share, but it's generally what you got here with that distinction, I think.
Okay, what is that? What is load ratio share? Maybe I'm not familiar with that term.
The percentage of the total load that the load serving entity represents. So its percent, its share of load is what is the load ratio share, rather than just taking it and dividing it equally across all load serving entities. That's pro rata. So I'm just making a distinction upon how the portion is determined.
Okay, yeah, that is what I had intended with this, but I like the share. Let's.
Great, thanks for the clarification.
Okay. Does anyone? Sorry, Kathleen, is that it? Or yeah. Okay, I see you took your hand down. So I'll go to Mary Winky next. So we're thinking in the hypothetical here of if the various regulatory bodies decide to allocate it to load, do we want to do it through this load ratio share or some other methodology? What do you think, Mary?
So just to answer that specific question, Kevin, I do think that the load ratio share allocation makes the most sense to me. And I think what would be helpful in this conversation is to think through sort of what we're accomplishing through this decision and why it's being made. And I'll tell you my perspective on that, though I'm certain there's nuances that I don't appreciate. But from my perspective, in the bilateral market, you are identifying the importer as the compliance entity with the specific idea that entity, that you're driving a carbon price, up the food chain, as it were, into the market, that you're driving that price signal. And sorry about the dog. I have a sick baby at home too, so ready to get the flavor today. Hold on one second here, Kevin. I'm sorry.
No problem.
So my perspective is that with respect to the bilateral market, the identification of that external entity as the importer and the application of the compliance obligation to that entity is driving a price signal, or theoretically driving a price signal, and serving a specific purpose in that way. Mm-hmm. And in the context of the zonal solution, the identification of the importer is not necessarily, in the same way, is not the mechanism through which that price signal is being, put in the market. Instead, the framework is to drive the dispatch signal through the application of the hurdle rate and collect the revenue associated with the imports. So it's a different framework, and I think by identifying a different entity as the compliance entity, or accomplishing a different purpose with this solution. I think the purpose that's being accomplished in the zonal approach is to identify an entity who has the obligation for reporting, verification, and to purchase allowances. And therefore, from my perspective, it's a more flexible. You have more flexible options in terms of figuring out, okay, who can the question is sort of who can best accomplish that versus you're driving some kind of policy outcome with this choice. So that's kind of why I think when Jeff and I were originally talking about this, we landed at sort of the simplest solution being the allocation to the load serving entities on a pro rata share, or sorry, load ratio share. The other thing though that I would hope we don't completely take off the table is the option for the CAISO to be the entity that either does that or contracts to have it done. I don't know if that's a complete non-starter for the CAISO, but I do think that is a potential option that would be relatively simple, at least sort of administratively. But I think it would be good. I know that there's most likely some concerns from the CAISO on that, but I do think it would be good to kind of understand whether that is sort of truly a non-starter and what the reasons are for that.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'm not trying to avoid that last question. I just wanted to make clear that, like, it's my understanding at least that the compliance entity would have to be decided upon through those regulatory processes. And so I didn't want to presume, I kind of wanted to skip over that step of who's going to be actually doing these activities versus how whichever entity or entities that is would be expected to gain the funds and settle it. So I take your
okay. I appreciate that, Kevin. I think you're right. I jumped ahead and didn't appreciate that. And it is very challenging to develop this solution when there's many elements that do kind of depend upon however the decisions made by regulators at a later date. So I appreciate that, and I'm sorry that I was not answering your question directly.
No,
but it'd be good to have the CAISO on here as an option, maybe.
Okay, yeah, but then so then some other methodology would just be CAISO direct settlement, or assigned to CAISO would be like a new potential assigned to CAISO.
Yeah, it's sort of a different category altogether, right? Yeah. It's not really supply or load.
Yeah. Okay, point taken. Cool. Yeah, I don't mind playing out that hypothetical. I just have to find a good new color. Let's do orange. Okay, and then this would just be directly settled with a state regulator. Okay. Thanks.
So, apologies that I was going on and on about a question you didn't ask.
No problem. It's a good suggestion. Okay. Cool. Well, just for the sake of closing this question out, I just want to see if anybody else has any thoughts on if the compliance obligation is allocated to load, how is the hurdle rate revenue settled? And I think I might just change this to pro rata based on load ratio share. Okay, just so we're it's not kind of a non sequitur there. So okay, the next hand that I saw go up was from Todd Jones. Todd, would you go ahead and introduce yourself and let us know what you're thinking in this area?
Sure. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Kevin, thanks. This is Todd Jones from Center for Research Solutions. I just had a clarification question, actually. I just wanted to clarify, are you just asking about the allocation of the hurdle rate revenue, or are you also asking about the attribution or allocation of emissions to LSE load, as opposed to sort of state or zonal load? Or is that something that you're saying would be left to the states? So I guess another way of phrasing that is, like, are you thinking that the allocation of the revenue here would carry any sort of specified delivery claim for the LSE?
Yeah, it's more the latter of what you were asking, that it's, the decision with who bears the compliance obligation and to whom the emissions are allocated is a decision of the state
Okay.
regulator. But
Yeah,
if it goes down the pathway of allocating it to load, how would we divvy it up in an equitable way?
Yeah, I agree with you on that, and I would just urge you to be very careful about how that is framed in this straw proposal.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yep, understood. Thank you, Todd. The next hand I saw up was Bonnie Blair. Bonnie, would you go ahead and introduce yourself and let us know what you're thinking?
Hi, yes, Bonnie Blair representing the Six Cities Group. I have to start with a question because I want to make sure I understand the framework we're dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
So in the unspecified zonal approach, an LSE, let's say an LSE located in California could have a PPA with a non-emitting resource in physically located in an external area,
Mm-hmm.
but with the resource specific pathway route, it could have that resource treated as being essentially directly assignable to it. Correct? Am I right about that?
Yes, that's correct. This is an alternative where.
Okay, so if you had an LSE located in California, for example, that had, say, 20% of, I'm just pulling numbers out of the air. These are totally hypothetical, but if an LSE in California had PPAs with non-emitting resources that were assigned to it through the resource specific pathway element of this framework and served, say, 20% of its load, then wouldn't a load ratio approach to assigning the hurdle rate revenues kind of over allocate the revenues and the associated compliance obligations to that LSE? In other words, don't you need to have some way of giving an LSE credit for direct assignments of non-emitting resources, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, that's a great point. So let me see if I understood what you were saying correctly. So in the case where a load serving entity has contracted to receive non-emitting output, it's about 20% of that load serving entity's load. That has been set up in one of these source specific pathways that we were discussing a few meetings ago. If we didn't exclude that percentage of the load that was being served directly from that non-emitting resource that was contracted, wouldn't we be over allocating to that load serving entity? Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question, but it seems like there would be, if you went strictly by load ratio share, there would be an ignored any kind of specific attribution of resources. You would be over distributing to such an entity.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So let's see. So I'm going to add that in as a second category. So pro rata based on load ratio shared, adjusted for, let's just say minus, let's say adjusted for load being served by source specific pathway. I think that's a pretty reasonable approach there. Does that capture what you were thinking there? Maybe.
Well, and maybe that's not far enough. Maybe not only adjusted for load being served by source-specific pathways, but what about non-emitting resources located in California that were owned by those entities?
Right. In that case, though, so just thinking this through, so the in-state non-emitting resources wouldn't create a compliance obligation. But your point is that
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, I think that's right.
But that load would be somewhat like served by those in-state resources. So
Right.
we need to be looking at whether that load serving entity was even importing at all, like if their supply wasn't sufficient to meet their demand.
But I guess so, yeah. I mean, does there have to be some sort of credit for resources that they own or have contracted with on a long-term basis that are located within the GHG zone and meet the some portion of their load on an ongoing basis?
Okay. Would it have to be just non-emitting resources, or would it also include, emitting resources too? Just this hypothetical that we're teasing out here.
I'm not sure.
Okay. Funny. I think this is a great suggestion, and I think it spurred some other folks thinking. Do you have anything else, or do you mind if I maybe see if
No, go ahead and see what other people think, because I'm not sure I'm going in the right direction here, but it was something I wanted to
at
least throw out for discussion.
Okay, sure. Well, the next hand that I saw go up was from Phil Schofield. Phil, do you have a direct response on this one, or a different pathway? We don't have to move past this if you want to. Okay, Phil Schofield, what are you thinking?
Good afternoon, Phil Schofield, Southern California Edison. So I've had, I think, concerns similar to Bonnie. I'm imagining, a fully resourced load serving entity in California, a small load serving entity in California that's leaning on the neighboring, leaning on the market, EDAM, EIM, and a large load that doesn't lean very much on the market. Should they pay essentially the same amount? Should they fully resource? Right, we're going to allocate a compliance burden, and then we're going to allocate a revenue. I don't know whether the revenue is going to fully offset the compliance obligation. But if I'm fully resourced in California, should I have an obligation to retire and to pay for? Or right, and so there's also sort of time of use considerations as well, right? The big emissions burden is going to be a particular time of day when everybody's short and the stuff has got a higher emission factor. Do we need to consider that? An annual netting exercise may blur a lot of detail, as some wiser people said earlier in this exercise. Don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. I don't want to over complexify things. I'm not sure complexify is a word, but we could get down the rabbit hole of detail if we're not careful. My worry is that this compliance obligation we're trying to retire maybe ought to not just be peanut butter on total load. There may be different levels of depth to pursue to try to get a better solution.
Yeah, point taken. And I think I guess I'm struggling a little bit internally with, on one hand, I think Mary brought up a good point, which is the hurdle rate revenue sort of is intended to serve a different mechanism it's basically just supposed to provide make whole payments, so to speak, to meet that compliance obligation. But on the other hand, we might be losing that price signal, which is also important. But I also don't know if we're drifting into the territory of the state regulator and thinking that through. But point taken on the additional detail that might be needed here, might be warranted, and if we try to tinker with it too much, would we be over tinkering? So
maybe over tinkering. I do think I agree with, I think it was Todd a minute ago, that this ought to not stray into additional reporting, right? The reporting is a totally different matter. This is about getting the dollars right.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Phil. So I see some older hands up. If you folks wouldn't mind lowering them down if you don't have anything else. Otherwise, I will go to Claire Bradenich. Claire?
Thanks, Kevin. And I actually wanted to respond to the last couple of comments from particularly Bonnie's. The way that she characterized and the concern she raised is not how we've been thinking about this approach at all. And the way we've been thinking about the zonal approach is that resources that basically are assigned to the zone on a source-specific basis would be assigned to the zone footprint. They would not be assigned to individual load-serving entities. So there would be no match, even though we're thinking about it in terms of there would have to be a contract with the load-serving entity to be resource-specific, or at least via one path. That doesn't mean that that resource within the market footprint is actually assigned to particular utilities. And the reason we're thinking about that is that the way we think about the market is dispatching across the entire footprint all resources to meet collective load. And so when we take that to thinking about price formation and settlement, if we were only worried about California and we weren't worried about carbon and we only had California resources and California load, load would be paying basically an LMP that's set by the marginal resource. It wouldn't matter whether that resource was owned by that utility or owned by somebody else. That resource would be setting the price. And so we would see that the price within the greenhouse gas zone is basically going to be set on a combination of a marginal energy bid and effectively a marginal greenhouse gas cost, which is potentially either a resource-specific greenhouse gas cost of either a resource physically located in the zone or a resource physically located outside the zone that gets to get behind the hurdle into the zone, or it could conversely reflect the hurdle greenhouse gas cost, and that's reflected in the hurdle rate. So we are not thinking about the resource-specific ones as being assigned to individual utilities. Under that context, under that approach, the way we're thinking about it, it does make sense then that the hurdle revenue is apportioned to load-serving entities within the greenhouse gas zone on a load rata basis, because we're not having to worry about backing the resource-specific assignment out. And I guess just one last point to the last comment. I mean, I think if something like this goes forward, we would also expect that the California Air Resources Board, if they accepted an approach like this would replace any sort of outstanding emission calculation that's done administratively by CARB, so that we wouldn't be effectively double assessing compliance costs on California load serving entities.
Okay. Yeah. Starting on that last one, I think that decision would be outside of what CAISO can do in EDAM, but I think it's good to have that perspective out there. In terms of your earlier point, maybe I'll give Bonnie a chance to respond to see if she has any thoughts on that. But Claire, if it's not oversimplifying, would it be fair to characterize your position as supporting this more simple calculation that doesn't have an adjustment? Would that be fair to characterize what you were thinking?
Yeah, I think that's the way we've been thinking about our approach. I mean, we've said we're on the fence as to which approach we're ultimately going to support, but that's the way that we've been thinking about this particular approach.
Okay, thanks. Bonnie, before I go to anybody else, your hand's still raised, so I was wondering maybe if you have a response to that. Otherwise, I can move on to the next hand that was up.
I guess I have, thank you, Kevin. I think I have a follow-up question. And again, I'm getting a little bit outside of my comfort zone because I'm not sure I fully understand how this works or is supposed to work. But so if I heard what Claire was saying, she was saying, okay, we're not attributing resources that are assigned to a particular GHG zone through a path, a specified delivery path to particular loads. We're just attributing it to the zone.
Mm-hmm.
I guess what that tells me then is that you wouldn't be allowing for self-scheduling of resources by loads, which I think the current day-ahead market allows. In other words, I believe that it's within the ability of an LSE in the CAISO that has a PPA with an external, either an internal or an external renewable resource to basically self-schedule the resource to serve its load, be a price taker. I mean, that may not be the best way to use the resource, but at least it's an option. So is Claire's approach to this that people wouldn't be able to self-schedule anymore?
I think, and maybe I don't want to speak for Claire here, but I think her point is if you were to self-schedule, you would just be a price taker in that scenario. And so, I think that's the connection to the peanut buttering approach. Pro rata based on load share approach. But Claire, I'll give you one chance to reply back to Bonnie, and then I'll move on to hear some other perspectives. Claire?
Yeah, and I may be way above my pay grade here, Kevin, because I'm really not a market expert. But my understanding is, my understanding is this would not prevent self-scheduling. But even self-scheduling today, you don't self-schedule to individual load. Your self-scheduling basically gets you to the head of the dispatch queues for your price taker, but it's not a scheduling to individual load. So I don't see this as running contrary to that in any way.
Okay, great. So let's see. I'm going to go to Mark Holman in a moment, but I see Phil and Todd still have their hands up. If you guys still want to speak, you can keep your hands up. If not, if you wouldn't mind lowering them down. But I'll go to Mark Holman. Would you go ahead, Mark, and introduce yourself first, please?
Thanks. Good afternoon. Mark Holman with PowerX. A good discussion. I feel like though we're bringing in some issues that aren't really issues, and maybe I can take a crack at explaining, because I agreed with Claire's description. I also agree with Mary, and maybe take a step back this way. If we just put the EIM aside for now and the deeming and algorithmic approach aside, today outside of that, through the intertie bidding framework, we have a framework that works, and you can bring in specified resources. You contract or own a specific resource. You submit an E-tag, you submit bids, economic or self-schedule. You have meter data, and you can identify the importer into California, who then takes on any reporting obligations and any carbon allowance. Nothing there that you couldn't leverage for the specified imports or the resources brought into the zone. So there's no challenges there. So let's focus on the unspecified.
Yeah.
And on the unspecified, it seems like we're getting stuck on how to allocate the reporting and who has to pay. And I think take a step back in terms of what the CAISO does in other regards. You know, the CAISO today collects congestion rent. As an example, it pays LMPs to generators, let's say outside of California. It charges LMPs to load inside California. There's a difference in which the CAISO has money, and the CAISO takes that money and hands it off, for example, in the EIM to EIM entities, perhaps, to give back to their customers. So they need to give that money to someone to settle up. This is a similar approach with unspecified. If we have an unspecified hurdle rate, let's just use a number for illustrative purposes. If it's $12 and the LMP outside is $30 because there's imports coming in, and let's say the hurdle rate binds, and the LMP inside California is 42, and there was 500 megawatts of unspecified imports through the dispatch, the CAISO is going to have that $12 times 500 megawatts. The question, so there's no missing money problem. Really, the question is, who do you hand that money to? Who's going to report a portion or all of that 500 megawatts, is going to take that money, buy the carbon allowances, and meet the obligations under the cap and trade program. And that could be the CAISO doing it itself. It could be handing the money to a third party who's willing to take on that responsibility, or it could be handing a little bit of it to each load on a pro rata share and say, can you each please report this amount, and here's your money to go buy your carbon allowances. But this is actually really quite straightforward. And to Claire's point, which is so important, there's no need to go and do this pro rata load ratio share to make up leakage, because you've got a specified source approach that is identified back to resources that increase their productions, demonstrate deliverability, and then you've got an unspecified approach which is consistent with the unspecified imports we see outside of the EIM, and that money has been collected in carbon allowances, purchases, and sold. So it just feels a little bit like the discussion's coming at it from the wrong side. You have money, you've collected the right amount. Who should we give it to go buy the allowances and report, I think is the question. And there's a few options, and I appreciate the discussion on the options.
Yeah. Thanks, Mark. I agree, and I think you framed it really well. I think where the rub is for us is that decision of who will bear that, like who do we give the money to, will be tied to who gets the compliance obligations. And we can't, through the ISO's EDAM process, determine who that would be, because that's a decision that sits with the state regulators. But it might be as simple as to say, do we agree that the entity that bears the compliance obligation should receive the funds to retire the allowances associated with the compliance obligation? That might be just the principle that we would abide by.
Yeah, I think that's what I would suggest. I mean, there's no missing money problem. So whoever we decide to, now I do think that you absolutely want to talk to the state regulators, but for California, for example, there's no reason the CAISO couldn't be the entity if it chose to do so. It could say, we're the ones taking title and importing the energy. We will take on the reporting obligation. We will buy the allowances and return them. I'm not advocating for that. I think it's really important to have dialogue around the pros and cons of different entities. You could put out, an RFP and say, is there an entity out there that's willing to take on and be identified as the entity doing it, gets a small fee? You could have load do it and say, we're going to allocate it pro rata to load, and you'll each take it on. So there's multiple options here, but I don't think it's in any way a challenge. You have the right amount of money. You just need to hand it to whoever is going to be the importer on record, so to speak, and have them report by the allowances and the right amount of allowances for the unspecified import.
Yeah. Okay. Noted. So I see a few hands up. I do want to move on to the hypothetical of if the compliance obligation was allocated to supply. We can spend a little bit less time on this, I think. But then I do want to make sure that we move on to the hurdle rate calculation. So just in the sake of keeping the conversation moving, I think we're somewhat converging on a pro rata based on load share type settlement situation here, understanding that it would be tied to the entity bearing the compliance obligation. But I will go to Vijay Satyal, who's had his hand up, and then I'll go to Kathleen, Phil, and Todd, and then let's move on to the next hypothetical. So Vijay, would you go ahead and let us know what you're thinking?
Yes, thank you. Hello, Kevin. Vijay with WRA. I actually really like what Mark just spoke earlier, because this is not a matter of who can do it, it's doable. The science is there, the process is there, and the tools are there. My crazy idea I wanted to offer is, when you finally come out with a policy proposal, and keeping it simple is also preferable. WRC sees value in that with the methodology. But how about, since there could be some potential room for legal nuance on the appropriate compliance obligation, what if part of the policy proposal you raise questions for the states that have this requirement with their LSCs or whoever the complying entities be, that they provide a response on what they think is feasible or not, because it would behoove the states, especially whichever states by then may have such requirements, to also not ignore this and get back. So my request is more procedural, is that when you develop a policy proposal, if you and or Anya can come up with specific questions that you want responses to as part of getting feedback, because I think that will help guide this also more effectively. So it's more procedural, but I agree on simplicity and number one. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Vijay. We'll take that into consideration. Yeah, good suggestion. So Kathleen, I think I had you next.
Thanks, Kevin. It's Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I jumped in the queue to say, that I fully support the way that Claire described the zonal approach proposal. And I think that Bonnie was raising good questions, but it really was getting at once there's a more solid understanding of the mechanics, I think it'll be clear why a need to adjust for load being served by source specific isn't relevant for the hurdle rate revenue being reallocated, because we're not going to include it in that hurdle rate revenue amount. It would have to be collected separately and reallocated out to that supply. But I am actually answering number two, but I wanted to support Claire and Mark, what they said. But so in light of how I view the design for this approach, a compliance obligation should be allocated to the source-specific supply for its source-specific costs that it represents in the market, whether that's internal or external, that are being represented as serving that greenhouse gas compliance area. I do not think that there is a pathway to allocate the hurdle rate revenue to any supply. I know you listed some options. They're kind of leaning in too far for us in the fiction of a resource specific being able to be identified, supporting unspecified. And the beauty of this approach is that we are leaning in on it being unspecified and we don't know where it's coming from a supply perspective. I think that really is the fatal flaw with trying to allocate the hurdle rate revenue. Of course, the source specific contribution of cost and revenue allocation would need to be given back to the supply, because they will hold that obligation by being source specific, but only for the hurdle. I don't think it can be allocated to supply.
Okay. Yeah. Point taken. Let's tackle that in a moment. I wanted to give Phil from SE one last chance, and if Todd has additional thoughts on this, and then we'll move on to that question of whether it really even makes sense that whether it is really even a hypothetical to allocate to supply. So Phil, go ahead.
Thank you. Sorry, Phil Schofield, Southern California Edison. So I'm reacting to Claire's comparison of LMPs to this GHG allocation. In the case of the market, I can protect myself from market prices by being fully resourced. So if if my loads and my resources match, I'm not really exposed to that price. But in this case, if we don't account for my immunizing myself with either in-state or zero emission resources, I can still end up carrying this cost. I understand we're also talking about allocating the revenue. It's not clear to me whether the costs and the revenues are going to be entirely offsetting. If they're not, then I'm holding the bag on a thing that I may really not have caused. So that's my worry. But thank you for that opportunity.
Yeah, thanks. That's a good point. One sec. All right, I'll go to Todd Jones, and then I want to move on to the second hypothetical, and then I'd like to get into the conversation about the hurdle rate calculation after that. So, Todd, did you have anything to add before we move on?
Hey, Kevin, can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
All right, thanks. Yeah, sorry, I don't mean to beat a dead horse here either, but I wonder if this the question could be restated as, are clean resources that are assigned to the zone backed out of the unspecified rate? I recall that an earlier presentation on the zonal approach did say something like the calculation of imports reflects that the out of zone resources, are in the zone. So I don't know if that's exactly the same question. And maybe this is a question for Claire as well, but we sort of thinking about this in terms of a residual rate. And it sounds like she's saying that we're not thinking that this would be a residual rate, if I'm correct about that. And I think we agree with Claire that the zonal approach generally doesn't deliver a resource-specific attribution, and it's a volume. But this goes back to my earlier question or concern about whether this allocation of revenue could be considered to carry some claim for the LSE. And it sounds like Claire's saying it's not, and that that's a financial allocation, and therefore it shouldn't be a residual rate. But I'm not sure, and if states are going to set compliance obligations based on this sort of unspecified rate that's used, for the hurdle rate, then perhaps it should be a residual rate. But I'd love to hear Claire's reaction to that if there's time.
Yeah, sure. As far as I understand the hurdle rate calculation, and we'll get to this in maybe 10, 15 minutes, but that it's not a residual rate as initially assumed in the version 2.0. It was basically just a fixed emissions rate based on, the initial starting point of the discussion was the CARB's unspecified rate multiplied by an allowance price. I think there's more complication behind it, but I don't think that it was dynamic to the system conditions, unless it's dynamic to system conditions. So I think we have to have the conversation about the hurdle rate separately. So just for the sake of maybe trying to close the topic down, I'd like to give Claire the last word on this, and just see if you want to respond to Todd or Phil. Claire? I think you were remuted, so if you wouldn't mind unmuting Claire, please.
Yeah, thanks. And very quickly, on the question of whether the revenue collected and revenue circulated back, I'll defer to those who know markets far better than me on that. I don't think in our thinking about it, we've thought that there's obviously a mismatch, but that's clearly something to explore. In response to Todd's question, and I don't want to go too much into, we'll talk in depth about how to set the emission hurdle rate, but I guess in my view, the emission rate that's used to set the hurdle is used solely for basically, one, determining the volume of the hurdle rate transfer, and then two, prices and settlement. It is not, in my view, it does not necessarily need to be the same emission rate that is applied for determining the compliance obligation across for hurdle transfers. And the example I've given several times is if we use a marginal emission rate for hurdle transfers, for the hurdle emission rate, that number would actually overstate, most likely, the average emissions if you looked across the footprint. And it also potentially, what we do for, what CARB does for signing a compliance obligation with respect to hurdle transfers could be a residual, it could be the default, it could be something else. So the only thing I want to point out right now is that those emission rates do not need to be the same. You could use one emission rate for purposes of the market, and CARB could use a different emission rate for signing a compliance obligation. And again, I recognize that's not your decision what CARB does, but I think it would help people to think about potentially different emission rates.
So, but in that situation, how would we make sure that those resources are not either getting an over allocation of funds or an under allocation of funds if there's a mismatch between?
Well, the resources are not going to get an allocation of funds. So anything behind the hurdle that's part of the bulk hurdle transfer is not, under a load, if we're recycling revenue to load, those resources are not going to get allocated funds. They're just basically getting priced at basically energy price LMP outside the greenhouse gas zone.
Okay, yeah. I think I follow. Okay, Mark and Mary, I'm sorry. I want to make sure we have a chance to at least consider this potential alternative, and we should have time if this is a shorter conversation than it really needs to be. But the question on this one is similar setup. We have the non-GHG zone serving the GHG zone. The hurdle rate has been overcome. And the question is, okay, in a hypothetical situation where it's allocated to supply rather than load, how would that hurdle rate revenue be settled? Would it be based on the megawatt generation in the non-GHG zone? Would it be the carbon intensity of the export into the GHG zone? Just kicking around that idea, or is it even possible that this isn't even a hypothetical because it's kind of either very unlikely and we just don't need to talk about it, or it goes against the spirit of the unspecified approach. But again, let's just, if we think it's totally out of the realm of possibility, we can just move on. But if we think it warrants further discussion to think about how we might allocate the funds, maybe we can kick this idea around a little bit. Again, understanding that the decision would be CARB's, not the ISO's. So I'll go to Mark Holman, who's had his hand up. Mark, did you want to respond to this, or were you thinking more back in the load world?
No, I can respond to this because I think it's kind of tied in. And again, I think we're making this confusing with I appreciate the questions, but I think the questions are, as you kind of highlighted, may not be applicable. I think this is pretty straightforward, and maybe a numeric example will help. If you've got 800 megawatts of imports from the non-GHG zone into the GHG zone, and 300 were specified source, that's going to work just like today. In terms of outside of the EIM today, a specified source is a real identified resource. It carries the obligation, as Kathleen described. They would get the money, and that can happen through the LMP, recognizing that they're going to see that higher LMP because they're treated as inside the zone, and then they're going to be responsible for their resource-specific emission rate. So that leverages everything that already exists today, at least from a carbon and cap and trade program. The 500 megawatts, where we don't know where it's coming from. We're not going to deem a resource anywhere. We know it's unspecified. We're going to accept that it's unspecified, just like we do outside the EIM when someone brings something in that, qualifies as unspecified. And then you're going to set the rate, the hurdle rate. And I would ideally, although Claire did describe you could set it wherever you want, I think the program could set up where it wants. And that's the, right now, I believe it was CARB who sets the 0.428. So one option CARB could have is it's 0.428 every single hour for unspecified imports, just like it is outside the EIM. You put in the 0.428 as the hurdle rate. If 500 megawatts comes in as unspecified, the CAISO will have exactly 500 megawatts times 0.428 of money. To Phil's point, there will be no mismatch or no need to allocate. And then an entity can take that money, buy the allowances at 500 megawatts times 0.428 and retire them. It fully works. If a regulator decides they want a different, to Claire's point, they could set it somewhere else. They could say, I don't want the marginal rate. I want the average rate, or I want a different rate per hour of the operating day. Maybe I want it higher in certain hours. I'm not advocating for that, but I'm saying one of the beauties of this approach is it really respects the regulator's choice as to where they want to set that rate. You can maintain revenue neutrality by setting the rate at the same as what the obligation is. Give that flexibility to the regulator. And I think this is pretty clear. Like, we seem to be asking questions that I'm not sure what the questions are, like in terms of allocating to supply, carbon intensity and megawatt exports. I think it's pretty straightforward. The specified works like it does today outside the EIM. The unspecified is a hurdle rate set by that program, by that regulator. The CAISO collects the money and that amount of emissions gets retired, and that's up to that program to decide where they set that emission rate. Average, marginal, the same throughout each hour of the day, the same throughout the year, wherever they want to set it. So I'm missing what the question is, maybe, Kevin, in terms of what's confusing about this.
Yeah, I am not personally confused about it, but I think the question that I wanted to raise was, okay, let's presume that the compliance obligation allocation process is outside the ISO's hand, which is in fact the case. Let's say that the regulators say, hey, we need the compliance obligation to sit with the supply resource. We can't just kick it to the load serving entities or somebody else. How do we allocate the hurdle rate revenue, which we've gathered, understanding that it'll be revenue neutral, to the supply, entities? What's the fair way of doing that, basically?
So let's talk a little bit about that. So when the EIM was developed, you came up with a new approach, deeming. And you implemented that, and you worked with CARB, presumably, to be able to give the revenue to effectively allow the deemed entity to receive the revenue through the LMP and have the deemed entity be the entity that has the CARB obligation. So I'm not seeing where this is a different or a challenge. If the CAISO wants to be the entity to take the money it has, because it's going to be revenue neutral, report and say, again, that they're the importer, I think it's the importer that has the obligation, not the supplier. And so if the CAISO wants to say, look, we're taking title here, we're the importer, and we'll take on the obligation, that seems like a feasible approach, as Mary suggested. But there may be others that the CAISO and CARB and stakeholders prefer. But I don't think it's a challenge, and I'm not aware of anything that says you got to hand it back to the source generator in some other state. I think it's the importer that has the obligation. The CAISO could easily be the importer. We could have someone else be the importer. I think what's really important about this is just the tremendous improvement in accuracy and the autonomy you give to the regulator to set that rate.
Yeah.
But as we can set it, the regulator can set it wherever they think it's most appropriate, recognizing that outside there's a mix of coal, gas, hydro, wind running, and we don't know where it came from. And I think CARB contemplated that and came up with their 0.428 as the appropriate rate they wanted to use at the time, given their understanding and perspective.
Okay. Yep. Thank you, Mark. Okay, so let's kick it to Mary for one last thought, and then let's move on to the hurdle rate. Mary, do you have any closing thoughts in this area? Thank you, Mark, for your comments, by the way.
Thanks, Kevin. Just really quickly, I was just going to suggest that it would be instructive to know how it works currently in the bilateral market, of how unspecified imports are treated in the bilateral market today. Presumably the importer is the one actually purchasing allowances, but those costs are applied somehow to load. I think it just would be helpful to understand how that works. And I don't know.
Yeah. I don't know either, and I'm not going to try to speculate, but I will flag that for consideration to the folks who are thinking through this. All right, so I'm going to move on to the hurdle rate calculation itself. I realize that we're going a little bit out of logical order here. We started these kind of detailed workshops on the source-specific paths, and then we moved to the end, which is this compliance reporting settlement thing, and then now we're going to the middle. It might be a little confusing, but I want to talk about the calculation of the hurdle rate. And just a reminder to everyone, so we have a GHG zone and a non-GHG zone. Some resources that are physically located in the non-GHG zone might have a source-specific way to serve the GHG zone. We're not talking about them. We're talking about those that do not have that source-specific pathway. So the way that they're going to wind up serving the GHG zone is by clearing a hurdle rate. The question at hand is, okay, well, how do we calculate that hurdle rate? The folks who originally presented this had said an initial assumption might be that we would calculate it based on the emissions rate, which would be tons of CO2 per megawatt hour multiplied by an allowance price, which is dollars per ton. Those cancel out. We wind up with $1 per megawatt hour hurdle rate. So the question is I basically want to tease out the individual elements of this. And I think we'll find that there might be a common theme here. So the initial assumption was to use CARB's 0.428 in the calculation of this hurdle rate. But Washington State, as far as I understand the regulation, it's using 0.437. So now we have a mismatch, right? The question is one, what should the emissions rate be based off of? And how do we handle situations where there's a discrepancy between the underlying states within the greenhouse gas zone? Or alternatively, do we actually have two greenhouse gas zones, and how might that work? But let's start with the hurdle rate calculation and the emissions rate that's used in it first, before we start thinking through. That was a helpful comment from a member of the Air Resources Board staff, which said that the difference between these two is a transmission loss factor. So they might actually be equivalent. So that might be good. But maybe I'll open the floor up to folks to see if they have any thoughts about, okay, are we good with this 0.428 emissions rate, or do we want to use a different rate? So the hand that I saw that came up directly from this is Kathleen Colbert. Kathleen, do you have any thoughts on this?
Sure, it's Kathleen Colbert from Mr. I was actually kind of delayed raising my hand. That's impressive. So with that said, I guess I'll jump into the fray. So our thinking is that just using that static 0.428 is probably not the best design choice that we could make. So a couple of alternatives to put on the table for us to consider. I do want to couch this as like these are options, but we wanted to put them on the table. Okay, cool. So best case scenario would be a dynamic rate that we can derive from something very similar to how Callie described on Tuesday, the baseline run, how that looks. So if you weren't to use it for that approach, but you were instead to use it for a hurdle approach, the question that I have is it possible to extract from that baseline run, which has block transfers, no virtuals, uses a forecast instead of bid and demand, just to remind folks, for the entire footprint, what the marginal resource is and what that marginal resource's emission rate for each of the hours that we are running that baseline run. If so, that could set a dynamic marginal emission rate to be used in the calculation that would then feed into IFM. It is an open question I have for the CAISO if they feel from a technology perspective that we can do that. So that's a question I'm teeing up. My other option, if it's not doable, to extract the emission rate, where I can see how that could be difficult in certain scenarios to determine the exact marginal resource. So that's why I think it's open. But an alternative would be I can get comfortable with a static rate that is developed as long as it's hourly, and it is a representation of that same concept of a marginal resource during the hour, so that specific hour ending 4, that historically a marginal resource's emission rate based on historical data to set a static marginal emission rate that represents the marginal resource across the footprint. And again, that would be hourly. And if you do a static, I think it makes sense to align it with the timing for calculating the allowance price as well, which is a monthly value. So it's kind of thinking a monthly static value that varies by hour.
Okay. Patterns. Yeah. So, Kathleen, great points and great suggestions. We jumped ahead a little bit, but I think they're all part of the same conversation here. So maybe I'll just hop down to that portion while we have that thought on hand. So, just thinking about the overall structure is the hurdle rate is just an emissions rate times an allowance price. There was some thoughts in the version 2.0 or of the unspecified or zonal approach that the hurdle rate might be dynamic, in other words, time variable, meaning that it would change by hour. And one of the suggestions was that it could be dependent on when there is, surplus renewable output, red excess solar in the middle of the day. Do we want to factor that into the calculation? So I was hoping to treat those topics as separate, but if that's not doable, I don't have any objections to thinking about this more holistically, at least the emissions rate, and then we'll tackle the allowance price separate. So, point taken.
Can I make
Go ahead.
quick clarification? I think I'm using dynamic differently, dynamic and static, and so if there's a better way to say it, that might be helpful. But if I could define what I mean by dynamic and static, what I mean by dynamic is it's a value that the market processes calculate during the day ahead market process that is then used to set the hurdle on a dynamic basis, versus static is a value that is calculated well in advance of any market process that we would know of for an extended period of time. The way I interpret your B, Kevin, is consistent with my use of the word static. And I think a static time variable input is the same thing I'm saying. I just don't think that's a dynamically produced value that was teed up in the past. It was a static time variable option.
This is Mark Rothler. Can you hear me?
Hey, Mark. Yep.
Let me chime in here because I think I understood the dynamic that Kathleen was referring to, and I think the challenge there. And I don't mean to keep on saying things are challenging. We deal with challenging things and we solve them. But the one challenging thing that I think always comes up, where at least where I've been told, is trying to come up with a solution that is based on the product of the solution. In other words, you don't know the rate until you know the solution, and the solution produces the rate. I think that is a technological solution problem in the optimization that would, I think, create an issue for creating the dynamic that you just said, where you don't know the rate until you know the solution.
So, Mark, I think Kathleen was leveraging this new potential run that was proposed in Tuesday's meeting, where this would happen before IFM.
You're talking about the base, RSE base run? You're talking about
It would either be the RSE base run or an entirely new run
Okay.
for the purposes of GHG accounting.
Okay. Okay. So what you're saying is you have a separate other solution, not the solution itself that's producing the variable rate. Okay.
Yeah.
Then I understand. That's a different story. So thank you for that clarification.
But varies by hour, but fixed ahead of time. So Kathleen, just to make sure I understand, just would you review A, B, and C to see if you think that these make sense?
Yeah, I'm looking at them, Kevin. I think for our purposes, this is good. Like I said, I just wanted to get the options on the table. I think A is suboptimal. I think B may have more challenges, even though I think it's doable. It's just, it adds an additional complexity, right? And C would be the simplest. That would be more accurate as far as like preferences, but I would love to hear other people's opinions on these options. Thanks.
Yeah, me too. And folks, I encourage you to raise your hand. I did try to game out some of the pros and cons to allowing it to change hour over hour. I was more, maybe I'll zoom out a little bit. I was more thinking of sorry folks, it's hard to control. Anyway, so I was thinking of this being static and this being the dynamic option. In other words, that it's time variable, but it's not a result of the market processes. So just thinking about the pros, having this, let's call this option A, and then this was option C. I didn't think through option B, but the pros of having a static value here is that it allows for more certainty, but I think it does have the potential to leave out, to keep non-emitting resources behind the hurdle in hours when we, in the middle of the day, it might limit the transfers in the middle of the day effectively. But on the other hand, if we have this time variable one, we might allow those transfers, meaning less curtailments if the transfers actually would, if the lack of a transfer were to cause curtailments. I'm not sure that they would or not. But, it might create issues if resources committed for multiple hours. How do we handle that? Might be jumpy, but these were just kind of speculative pros and cons. So maybe I can get a reaction to the three different options that were put on the table so far of how do we want to determine the emissions rate here. The next, Mark Holman has had his hand raised for a while and he's been patient. So maybe I'll go to Mark. Do you have any thoughts on the emission rate here?
Yeah, it's a really good discussion. And I think it's helpful to, frame it and frame it with an illustrative example. So if you have, let's say we have 1,000 megawatts of imports into the GHG zone. And let's just say, hypothetically speaking, 300, we are able to identify accurately that those resources are specified. They're increasing their production. They've got delivery. They intend to deliver that supply to the CAISO. So they meet all the requirements, just like you'd see in the bilateral world. Mm-hmm. Whether we use the deeming approach, the zonal, et cetera, I think we'd all agree we want those resources to come in as specified at their resource specific rate. Now we have 700 megawatts remaining. And remember, as long as we make sure that pathway for clean resources, for specified resources to get in is one that enables, so it enables if there's more clean resources that can be delivered to California or Washington according to their rules, We want to encourage that. And so we've determined in the example, there's 300 that can do that. 700, we don't know where they're coming from. So when I think about the different options, I put candidly on one end of the spectrum, maybe at the far end of the spectrum would be to say, well, let's just assume the 700 is all clean. It's all zero. Let's just make that assumption. Well, that would be a bad outcome. It would clearly not be accurate because it might be zero, it might be gas, it might be coal, it might be some mix. We don't know. I'd put next on the spectrum in terms of accuracy of the programming, a deeming approach. A deeming approach says it disconnects which resources are actually increasing and delivered from which ones can get deemed. There's no link in the software. So it treats them as specified, but it gets it inaccurate. Not intentionally so, but that's just, it's specified, but it's not accurate. The next best, getting better as we move along the spectrum, would be to say, okay, we don't want to treat them as zero. We don't want to treat them as specified inaccurately. Let's assume a 0.428, which is, I think, what CARB largely did when they launched their program. EIM was not around yet. What are we going to do when we have imports coming in and we really don't know where they're coming from? Let's apply what's a good, safe assumption to get the dispatch right, get the price signal right as best as we can do, and it was 0.428. If we assume, a gas resource is kind of a good proxy, let's put 0.428. The next best, even better than that, would be to start to, as Kathleen described it, you could have a different rate in different hours of the operating day. You could have a different rate in different months of the year. It's still static, but it's not the same every hour. Then even better would be to go to dynamic. Let's see if we can try to determine it each hour. I would say let's kind of think along the spectrum. When we go to the zonal with 0.428, that's in our view, a big improvement. I think Kathleen, calls when you don't do that, it's kind of the fiction of deeming, or if we were to assume zero, this is a step better, saying we don't know it perfectly, but 0.428 is a good proxy. And then if the regulators think, and I really think we should engage the regulators, this is not a CAISO decision or a market operator decision. If the regulators, from the information, the CAISO can certainly support that with their reporting and knowledge, think we can do something better, like get to a static but shaped rate, let's call it that, then we can keep advancing. The other part that I really want to stress is that this not only gets the dispatch and the pricing increasingly more accurate as we move along this spectrum, but it actually can create fantastic reporting for those regulators, because now we can kind of see how much actually came in as I specified, where did they come from, what were the technologies, how much was unspecified, and we can kind of improve as we move forward. So I like having the options out there. I appreciate the dialogue. I really think we got to think about unspecified and a hurdle rate and revenue neutrality as a very significant improvement over inaccurate specified.
Okay, yeah, there was a lot there that I really liked. I honestly hadn't thought it through and connected, but maybe I probably should have, the 428 as being necessitated by some sort of regulatory process, or at least interlinked with it. But of course, if we were to propose, I liked the framing the phrasing that you had, where we have static but fixed by hour, static, shaped by hour, and then we have dynamic, meaning it's an output from the market, as Kathleen was proposing. Ultimately that's going to be used to retire compliance obligations. So there might have to be a connection between the two. So, go ahead.
Sorry, Kevin, I think that's important. I think maintaining that connection takes away a lot of challenges, right? When we had this issue where we really didn't have a connection and we had the leakage, as I understand it, CARB had to put in another mechanism and then figure out who to allocate those costs or those obligations to. If we maintain a connection between what the regulators want those unspecified to come in at, whichever approach and whichever number, with what the hurdle rate is, then we maintain revenue neutrality, and there really shouldn't be any concerns with, hey, who's gonna end up collecting and reporting, and is it gonna cost me some money, because we've got that revenue neutrality achieved. So I really like maintaining that revenue neutrality, because I think it simplifies things.
Yep. Okay. All right. The next hand I saw up was Mark, if you don't have any more questions, if you wouldn't mind lowering your hand, just trying to keep an eye on the queue.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. The next hand I saw up was VJ, and then I'll go to Claire after that.
Yes, hi. I cannot get to the depth of the sophistication that Mark had earlier, though I understood what he was trying to convey. My comment is on item C, 1C, is a marginal emission rate is a marginal emission rate, and it's not necessarily influenced by the quantity, but I don't know what you would have meant by historical patterns. So if that turns out into a proposal, it'll be valuable to be clear on not just the time frame of what historical pattern you're looking at, but also would the historical pattern, if you were to set something now, be only based on your California experience and not have any flows and knowledge out of that would impact and influence the Washington requirements, because you may have some EIM entities out of the Northwest that are participating in the current EIM. And if that's what you mean by historical patterns that you would use, or the main Cal ISO regular day ahead in real time. So pardon my ignorance here, but I was tripped by historical patterns and what you'd be relying on. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a great. I don't think it was. I think it is an open topic of conversation. So the way I looked at it was, if you looked, forgetting what area we're looking at right now, for each hour, say hour ending 4 might presume that the marginal resource is a gas resource, whereas hour ending 12, it might be presumed that the marginal resource is a solar resource.
Yeah.
And that would be based on some sort of historical analysis. That said, what area we're looking at and would we want that? I think by nature, the hurdle rate has to be consistent, as in we can't apply a different hurdle rate to different geographic regions for the
Correct.
same time interval. But yes, that would need to be, that's sort of what I was getting at in these thoughts here.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay.
So we haven't quite got there, but I think it's a great question.
Thank you. That's what I was trying to get at, and I think you hit the nail on the head for me, was not trying to create so many multiple hurdle rates based on different nuances of location that then you're creating maybe a modeling nightmare. But more importantly, being mindful of which anyways, I know George will have a lot of work to do. But I think my concern mainly was what you define by historical patterns, and also that your sample pool of historical pattern right now may be limited to California and neighboring interchange points with entities versus what EDAM might bring is a lot more bigger set of players and much larger quantity. Thank you.
Good point. Okay, let me go back to the list. Oh, okay, this got a little bit longer. The next hand that I saw up was Claire, and then I'll go to Stuart after that. So Claire, what do you think about the emissions rate, at least?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. So I think the way we're thinking about it, we agree with kind of the ranking that both Kathleen and I think Mark laid out. And our thinking is that, as I think Kathleen indicated, a dynamic marginal would be ideal. And again, I'll defer to others as to whether that's doable or not. But I just wanted to say a bit more about why we think that's ideal. And to clarify first, I think what we would be looking for is the emission rate of the marginal fossil unit within the entire footprint. If the marginal unit based on like energy bids is hydro, it does us no good to set an emission rate based on a hydro resources emission rate, because that would be zero and it'd take us back to square one in terms of our secondary dispatch. So one piece would be, it's got to be the emission rate of the marginal fossil resource. We'd love to see it, the resource that's marginal across the entire footprint, because then you could use that resource, that emission rate in both greenhouse gas zones, as you suggested. And the reason why we think marginal is important is it gets you closer to what the theoretically correct result is. And I mean theoretically correct in that if the emission rate that's used to set the hurdle is too low, then we're going to get displacement of resources within the greenhouse gas zone and emission leakage secondary dispatch. Conversely, if the hurdle rate is too high, then we may not necessarily see any impact on emissions, but we may see higher LMPs within the greenhouse gas zone than we ought to. And that the hurdle rate is, if there is a hurdle transfer, that hurdle rate is likely to be what's going to drive the spread between prices within the greenhouse gas zone and outside. Let me see if I had anything else in my note that I wanted to say. Okay, that's it.
Okay, thanks. Cool. I'll go to Stuart Kelly, and then I do want to talk a little bit about the allowance prices before I turn it over to my boss's boss, my colleague Mark Rothletter. So let me go to Stuart Kelly to see if you have any thoughts about this emissions rate that we're using in the calculation of the hurdle rate, or just any general thoughts on the hurdle rate. So Stuart, and if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself first too, that would be helpful. Stuart Kelly. Hey, operator, would you, Adam, would you mind unmuting Stuart Kelly's mic?
Kevin.
There we
go.
This
is a great dialogue. I appreciate the comments from the two Marks and Claire. And one of the things that we've been wondering at LA is there a way of, potentially dynamically calculating what that emission rate is, recognizing the fact that what Mark Rothletter said, you can't, you need the hurdle rate to ultimately, determine the emission rate and vice versa and all that good stuff. But if you bypass the hurdle rate and you dynamically, as Claire is proposing and Mark suggesting, Holman on a spectrum, dynamically can calculate the weighted average emission rate, then I think everything stays whole. There is no secondary dispatch concerns, I believe, and the other concerns, and then apply that CCA times that weighted average directly to load based on that marginal cost of GHG. That's what we've been thinking about internally at LA. There may be a way around this to calculate that dynamic rate with the CCA adder, and as you said earlier in the meeting, just directly for the optimized portion of all this, have load pay for that. And you can work out all the other mechanisms, as Mark Holman says. I mean, that becomes secondary. But I'm just wondering if you can actually bypass the hurdle rate and do it dynamically on an hourly basis. That's what we are thinking about. And as we work through it, if we feel that's possible, we can get further comments to everybody on it.
Okay. Do we have any reactions out there? I think I saw Mark Holman's hand shoot up on this. So Mark, I'll give you the last word on this. Maybe you want to react to what Stuart was saying. And then I want to talk a little bit about allowance prices, recognizing that we've got about 10 more minutes after. Mark?
There's a couple things on that, and I'll try to be brief, but I really think it's important, although I really appreciate Stuart's perspective, and I get the logic behind average. We really do, when we have markets, to get markets efficient, you do want to, in our view, use marginal. Marginal is important in everything we do, right? If you look at LMPs, it's the marginal cost of the resource. So when you get the marginal price of the resource, and the simple assumption is 0.428 that's been used, that's going to affect the dispatch and the LMPs. And it's so important to get those price signals right, because then it sends that signal to say if there's more clean resources out there that could be brought online, developed, and delivered to California, please do so, because you're going to reduce the emissions of the marginal import that we think is at 0.428. And so marginal pricing is so critical in all markets, but in organized electricity markets, getting that price right is just so important. The other thing I'd say is just be careful about the hourly shaping. We can run into double counting issues if we don't get that right. And so there's a lot of opportunity there, but just because solar is running in the external region, if somebody is using that to meet their load under their environmental program, you don't want to assume that's the marginal resource coming into California, or we got two different regions thinking they're getting an environmental benefit from that resource. And so I think there's great opportunity here to get it right. It may be zero a lot of the time during renewable oversupply, for example, in certain circumstances. If we
yeah, and that's a fair point. You will capture the marginal cost of the GHG component, and if you look at the 0.428, as we're suggesting, that is the weighted average, and that's how CARB came up with it. And in your scenario where there's zero emissions from a high resource, that becomes zero. So I think it covers that piece. Point well taken, Mark. But let us think about it more and circulate.
Yeah, and happy to take it offline because just want to get to getting that dispatch and pricing right.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Mark and Stuart. Those were great comments. Let me just raise one more topic. So we have this hurdle rate, which, as I've maybe said ad nauseum, is the function of, I used to know the word for this, but it's the multiple of emissions rate times allowance price. This assumes that there is a singular allowance price, though. We are aware that the two programs, Washington and California's, won't be linked at the onset of the EDAM, which is expected in January of 2024. So that means, in any case, we know that there will be two marginal allowance prices for those respective programs. So the question in my mind is, okay, which hurdle rate, or which one do we use as an input into the hurdle rate? Do we use the higher of the two, an average, or is there really a third option where we have two separate GHG zones behind different height hurdles? I don't know the answer to this, so if someone can help me, that would be appreciated. But let me just give a little bit of background. This allowance price, the way that the ISO currently gets it, is we contract with two vendors who provide us a weighted average index price on a daily basis. And we take the simple average of those index prices and use it for various things in the market. But that's just for California CARB's cap and trade program. Theoretically, there would be something like that in Washington, which would come up with a different price, because I expect it would be a bit different because the programs aren't linked at the onset. So what are we thinking for this component of the hurdle rate calculation? Let me turn it over to Kathleen Colbert. I realize that we've probably only got about 5 more minutes left for this conversation, and unfortunately just didn't have time to discuss this more. But Kathleen, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. I'll be brief. Kathleen Colbert, Vistra. So unlike VJ, I do think that the hurdle rates themselves will be different into two different greenhouse gas areas, because while the emission rate may be the same, the allowance price will likely be different until linked. So in a non-linked world, the allowance price, I would recommend we align it to the same processes that we have for determining the GHG price that we use today for CARB. And really the change is to now extract from our vendors, ICE and Argus, the Washington allowance price. So for the CARB area, we use a December vintage. I recommend we align those. I think it's helpful that we use the same time between the two allowance prices. So my principle is, let's try to keep it as consistent as possible, but recognize that there will be two different allowance prices. The open question that I have that I'm still thinking through is we calculate that for a monthly value, and then I believe we also recalculate it on a daily basis. And so which is the right one to use? for this hurdle rate, still an open question in my mind. So I'd like to ask the CAISO to consider that as you think through this round proposal. If the monthly greenhouse gas or the daily greenhouse gas is the better proxy to use for this expanded area. I do want to touch on you asked, so once we have the hurdle rate, there are two different hurdle rates, how would they work? Well, there'll be two different hurdle rates. And I think the added complexity that we should recognize that this approach would do between the two areas, because it's simple from external area into those areas, is that the lower hurdle rate will most likely be able to, LODE will be able to procure unspecified resources first into the lower area because of economics, and the higher hurdle area will probably come next. But what about between the two? Between the lower hurdle rate area and the higher hurdle rate area, I would think that the higher area would only need to exceed the difference. So if it's $30 per megawatt hour hurdle rate in, let's say, Washington, and it's 40 in California's compliance area, then California would need to be willing to pay an additional hurdle of $10 to make them whole. But that would take some regulatory changes, I think, maybe. But that's something I'd like feedback from the environmental regulators on, because embedded in that is a recognition that the $30 is getting paid to the Washington from the Washington resources. It's just the incremental cost that California is paying. So it's more of a system approach. Happy to take questions.
Yeah, I think I'll start with the last one first. I think that is ultimately up to the Air Resources Board and the Department of Ecology in California and Washington, respectively. But point taken that I think that was something that the initial offering of the unspecified approach flagged as a potential change, but that would sort of be outside of our purview in the market. So I think Kathleen was then suggesting to have two different hurdle rates. That is not something that I had thought would be feasible because of the implication that you mentioned, that the transfers would always occur first to the lower priced region and then to the higher priced region after that. But I don't know if we have time to handle that. Let me.
Can I respond briefly and let you throw it out? And I just want to say that I think that it's a good concern. And as we work through the mathematical formulation, it's something we should consider. But my thinking is not that it be binary, but that they be able to compete. Because you have to keep in mind that the economics is going to be driven not only by the greenhouse gas cost, but also by the resources underlying cost. So it's not a binary outcome, but we'll keep working through the mathematical formulation and follow up.
Okay. Thanks, Kathleen. I don't think, well, let me do a status check. Mark Rothletter, do you want to provide any closing remarks? And if so, how much time would you want?
No, I think I can do mine in 5 minutes. So if you guys want to continue on with the discussion, please do. I think this is a good discussion to have. I do think that this notion of having multiple rates in different areas, I think has some complexities, not just to the zonal approach, but also to the source specific approach, because then you have the same problem, a similar problem in that a resource has now effectively two GHG costs, one to one region and one to the other region. And I think it ends up being a similar issue. It's going to go wherever economics drives it. So I don't think that the two rates is a unique problem to the zonal.
Yeah, because with the resource specific approach, all things equal, if you're putting in the actual marginal cost of your resource, which is a function of the emissions times the allowance price, and the allowance price is lower for a different area, that would just result in a lower greenhouse gas bid, say, to Washington would to California. So
Yeah.
Point taken. Let me see if Mark Holman had chewed through any of these ideas when crafting up the. Go ahead, Mark.
Thanks, Kevin. And I agree with Mark Rothleader. Appreciate that comment that once you get to multiple states with different zones, there's complexity. That complexity is not unique to the zonal approach or to the deeming approach. There's a couple different things that come into play, right? One is different costs or rates. For example, if they're both cap and trade, different allowance prices, which is what you touched on. There's theoretically other things that could be different too, right? You could have a different unspecified rate. There's also the complexity of, do the programs recognize that carbon has been paid in the other jurisdiction? And so it shouldn't be charged twice if one of the GHG zones is importing from another one. And so there is complexity to work through. I just think it's really important to acknowledge what that complexity is, that complexity exists under any approach. Coming back to the earlier point that Kathleen made, and it'll go to the lowest zone. I think what's really important about the zonal approach, unlike the deeming approach, is it's tied to the imports. So just because a region has a lower, let's say, unspecified rate or hurdle rate coming in, that doesn't mean imports are going to go there, because it's only going to import energy if the total price is economic relative to the resources that are otherwise available. For example, the resources inside that zone, and then adjusting for losses and congestion. Same with the other zone. In a deeming type approach, regardless of which deeming it is, you're going to deem most economically. But I think once you're in a tying the physical imports to the unspecified imports and the emission rate, it's going to reflect much more, as Kathleen pointed out, than just the emission rates. Does that zone require energy, and is it economic to import that energy? One other thing I'd say is that there is opportunity there too, that, obviously discussion of cap and trade and linking is well down the road between two states, but you can get to a point in the future where you could start combining zones if there was arrangements between those states to say, hey, we want to make this more efficient. We're close enough to each other. Let's apply a common unspecified rate. Let's recognize that carbon's been paid in each jurisdiction. Then you can kind of treat it as one zone for calculating the unspecified import. So a lot of complexity there. I think we have to work through that anyways, way more than we can cover, and still give Mark his 5 minutes here. So I'll maybe stop there.
Yeah, I actually think that we have some of that sorted out. So we, the unspecified rates, I portrayed them as being different here, but it was raised that they're actually the same. This one just doesn't include, well, this one does include losses. I don't know. One of them includes losses explicitly in the unspecified rate, and the other handles it elsewhere.
And that's a good example, Kevin. Just follow up that let's assume they're identical because they're close enough and it's losses. To kind of Kathleen's point, which I agree with, is that, if let's say one of the jurisdictions has a $30 allowance price, the other has a $40, then they're going to see that difference reflected in the cost of more unspecified imports to displace internal resources effectively. And so the one that's got a $40 allowance price is going to say, I don't want to start taking more unspecified imports until I cover that $40 times the 0.428. And so you see what I'm saying? It's going to tie in with the economic displacement of physical resources, because it's saying we price carbon higher. And I think that will actually work with two zones and being able to reflect that. I think then you got to talk about the reciprocity between the zones. Is it recognized, and how do you deal with that? And again, complexity under any approach.
Yeah. And just on the reciprocity, I think we know at least on January 2024, we can assume that's not going to exist. So yeah, but point taken. And thanks for all the great comments today, Mark Holman. I will give the mic over to Mark to close us out. So Mark, do you have any final thoughts for us?
Well, I think this conversation has been great. It's satisfied my group therapy for the year, and I'm being facetious a little bit, but the, I really do enjoy these discussions. I think it's really trying to solve a puzzle, and I appreciate all the thoughtful comments that have gone into this discussion. I know today is kind of the ending of a longer process, but as I've dropped in and listened to the conversations have become really super more informed, super more substantive, and the discussion has, I think, evolved to be more and more constructive. I think in doing so, we have to recognize that these are challenging issues, and they're going to be challenging discussions, and people have opinions, and at times personalities and opinions get frayed, and I understand that. But I think overall, I'm very happy with the process because it has exposed what I was expecting to expose in terms of kind of the options, and it has highlighted some of the pros and cons of the options. And I think it has really solidified for me that this is an economic issue, it's an environmental issue, it's a technology issue, and we're all trying to come up with a satisfactory solution that keeps the market opportunities flowing. I'm not gonna declare today where I stand because I think it would be detrimental, and I don't even know if I know where I stand after hearing this discussion. My opinions have probably been moving around as I hear different things, but I think regardless whether it's the source specific or modified source specific or enhanced source specific or a zonal approach, it's clear that there's some additional things that we have to work out. Some of these things are things we have to work out with the regulators. Some of the things we have to work out with the market in terms of the market incentives, and make sure we get things right. And we want to be accurate as much as we can. So I think the good part about this is I think we've got two solutions with variants, and I think we can learn from both of them. And I feel pretty encouraged that we will find a solution that works, and we will find a solution that is workable to support EDAM. And we keep on talking about kind of does it work for California regulators? We have to acknowledge this is not a system now just for California regulators. We've got the Washington program, we have the California program, and we also have to acknowledge we also have other states with also other clean energy policies that also have to be recognized, even if it's not a GHG cap and trade program. We have to recognize those other states and how they're managing and how we're accounting for, even if it is contract-based or load-serving entity-based declaration of how their load is being served. I think we have to understand that, acknowledge that, and account for that as well. And there's going to be states that don't have clean energy or GHG policies, and we also have to recognize and accommodate those. So it's a complicated set of things, but I think the discussion here, and especially today, I'll say especially today, has kind of simplified it and made it more digestible, and really offered some additional thought about what the pathways are forward. I think there is a solution, so I'm hopeful about that. Where we go and what that solution is to be determined, and through additional discussion, documentation about the straw proposal, feedback on the straw proposal, discussions with regulators, I'm confident that we'll get there. So I appreciate, let me just say, I'll end with, as I think everybody has said today, earlier, really appreciate everybody's time, commitment to this process, and really engagement. So thank you. Thank you for all those who have put in the time to actually present, create examples, and engage in the discussion. It's been very, very helpful. And I will take comments if there is any comments or questions.
I'm not seeing any in the queue, Mark.
All right. Well, thanks. And Kevin, thank you. Thank you to you and the team from the ISO. I think it's been a very good moderated process, and look forward to kind of the summaries and how we go from here to the STAR proposal.
Great. Thanks, Mark. I think we'll give our final send-off. Thank you, Brenda and Brian and Phil and Milosh and everybody who participated in the working groups. It's been nice working with you. So thank you very much.